Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cadigan, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Holy Cross Lunchtime Learning webinar event. This is the latest in our continuing series of web-based presentations that feature Holy Cross faculty members discussing their area of expertise and research. We're thrilled to have Matthew Schmalz, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, joining us today for a talk entitled Mercy Matters, reflecting on the extraordinary Holy Year of Mercy, a very interesting and timely topic, especially based on the response to this webinar. Professor Schmalz holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. An expert in the papacy, his areas of research focus on global Catholicisms, Hinduism, and modern religious movements, and we're so happy to have him join us today. We'll be together for a little under an hour, a great opportunity to relive your Holy Cross classroom experience. Professor Schmalz will speak, and then we'll take questions from you, our listeners, for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions throughout this presentation by checking out the question function located on your webinar toolbar to the right. Thank you for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Matthew Schmalz.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And we're here in Fenwick Hall, and I can see the courtyard. And it's kind of a humid day, a little bit overcast, but we have air conditioning in the office here, so things should be okay. And Tom insisted that I put a picture of myself on the slides of the PowerPoint presentation. So there you see my picture, as small as I can make it, but I'm also live here, even though you can't see me. This is certainly not pre-recorded. So welcome everyone, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity for us to share the next hour or so together. And I'd certainly like to extend a special welcome to former students who I've had the privilege of teaching. I was able to look at the roster before the program began, and there were so many names that were familiar to me, obviously, but brought back such great memories. And I want you to know, each and every one of you who have been in my classes, how much you've enriched my life and the life of the college. And I'd also like to welcome those of you who I have never met or haven't had the opportunity to meet, but who have so graciously devoted an hour of your time today to reflect on mercy and why it matters. And all of us who teach at Holy Cross, who are really privileged to teach at such a great institution, are grateful for the extended Holy Cross community of which you all are an important part. And it is the alumni who really support not only the work that we do, but the overall mission and identity of the college. And all of us who are here are aware of that as we're teaching, researching, and contributing to the community here. As many of you, I think, know, at Holy Cross I'm usually called by my first name, Matt, or Professor Matt. And I've been at Holy Cross for 18 years, which is, I guess, moving me up on the seniority scale. I'm married, and I'm the grateful father of 2 teenage daughters who make sure that I don't take myself too seriously. And I also have a large standard poodle named Harold, who was a flunk out from assistance dog training school. And I've just completed a book, Mercy Matters, Opening Yourself to the Life-Changing Gift, which is now available in print and electronic versions on Amazon and from our Sunday Visitor Press, and it's also available in the college bookstore. So I've been thinking a lot about mercy in the past year, and as all of you know, the screen is locked. Let us see here. Okay. There we go. Okay. Those of you who've also taken classes with me know that technical difficulties are something that I handle with great precision, care, and calm. So the screen is now unlocked. And as all of you know, Pope Francis has proclaimed this year as the Jubilee Year of Mercy. And there have only been 3 extraordinary Jubilee years in the history of the Church. And the last one was called by St. John Paul II in 1983 to commemorate 1,950 years since the birth of Jesus. So a Jubilee year within the Christian tradition echoes the ancient Jewish tradition of a universal pardon that was often given especially to prisoners. And within the Catholic tradition specifically, a Jubilee year is a time for pilgrimage and also a time for the remission of sins. And so in dedicating this year as a Jubilee focused upon mercy, Pope Francis wants us to renew our appreciation of the crucial role of mercy in the life of the Church and to reflect upon God's merciful presence in our own lives. So what I'd like to do in this webinar and the time that we have together is to overview what Pope Francis has written about mercy, particularly in Misericordiae Vultus, his bull of indiction inaugurating the Holy Year of Mercy. And I'd really recommend it as really edifying and spiritually important reading. And so I'll survey the themes that the Holy Father identifies when it comes to how we think and feel about mercy. But I'll also connect his reflections to those of his predecessors, particularly those views of St. John the 23rd, St. John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, all 3 of whom strongly identified mercy as a crucial and indeed foundational aspect of our relationship with God and of God's relationship with us. And so while it's certainly true that Pope Francis has brought his own distinctive style to the papacy, his thoughts, I would argue in any case, are very much in continuity with those of his predecessors, particularly Benedict and St. John Paul II. And this is something that I think we should all appreciate and remember, even as we appreciate how distinctive and groundbreaking Pope Francis's papacy has become. And so what I would like to do is open the question of mercy or issues surrounding mercy by referring to a story. It's actually something that happened, which I tell in the 2nd chapter of my book, Mercy Matters. And I'll return to this story at the conclusion of my remarks to bring us back to the concrete issues concerning mercy after we've surveyed church teachings on the issue and what Pope Francis means by calling it an extraordinary Jubilee year. And for those of you who know me as a teacher or remember me as a teacher, I think you're well aware of how I like to share stories to frame particular issues. And so what I'd like to do is share a story about mercy that I discuss in the book. And it's actually a story that I first wrote about, or an experience that I first wrote about in the Washington Post. And so it really was not only transformative to me personally, but served as a foundation for later writing this book to celebrate the Jubilee Year of Mercy. And it seems to me, and it's always seemed to me, that Pope Francis was asking all of us to be bold in sharing our experiences, our concrete experiences of mercy as manifested in our own personal lives. And so the 2nd chapter of my book talks about bullying, and I'd like to share a little more about it as a way to frame our discussion about what mercy means before we move forward. So it was about 8 years ago, and I was invited to my high school reunion. And I think this is an experience that many of us can relate to. High school reunions are a time of expectation and excitement, but also a time of high anxiety, shall we say. And I think anxiety was the feeling that was closest to my consciousness when I attended my 25th high school reunion, and I stepped into the lobby of the hotel to greet old friends and those also who I only vaguely remembered. So I arrived and I engaged in small talk with a number of people who did recognize me, and I eventually wound up on a patio where I tried to collect myself and sort of brace myself for more small talk and more meetings with people whom I only vaguely remembered. So I was there on the patio outside of the hotel, and I heard a voice calling out to me, Matt Schmalz, get over here. And I looked, and it was someone I had known from elementary school. I mean, I recognized him from high school, but my most vivid memories of him had to do with elementary school back in the early 1970s when I watched Kukla, Fran, and Ollie and wore tough-skin jeans. And so it was a man who I will call Zach to protect his privacy and anonymity. Even though I have shared this story with him, obviously, and thanked him for the experience that followed. So I recognized Zach, and I got really nervous. My anxiety, shall we say, intensified. And I was really afraid that he was going to come over and bash my face in. And I mean that literally, not just figuratively. And the reason why I was so nervous and the reason why I was so afraid was because I was ashamed. I was ashamed because way back, again in the early 1970s, in third grade, I bullied Zach. Okay, so I was the bully, not Zach. And I made fun of him mercilessly. And we got in fights, as I remember, even though we sat side by side in class and helped each other with math occasionally in between our fights. So there I was, and Zach was calling out to me, and there was no way I could avoid him. And I was wondering, you know, what should I do? What was he going to do? And so this is where mercy comes into play. What would you do? Okay, so say you were Zach, and you met someone, say, at a party or a high school reunion or a college reunion for that matter. You met someone who had bullied you. How would you respond? Would you pretend nothing had happened and just engage in chit-chat and small talk, shake hands, and so forth? Would you demand justice? Would you confront the person who bullied you? How would you handle it? Now imagine the reverse. Imagine not that you were Zach in this case, but me. And you were the bully. You met someone who you had treated badly in your past. Again, would you just engage in small talk? Would you avoid the issue entirely? Or would you fess up? Would you apologize? Would you ask for forgiveness? Would you ask for mercy when a person had the right to demand justice from you? And so these are the questions, I think, that Pope Francis wants us to engage with, and not just as abstractions, but within the context of our own personal lives. So we'll return to what happened between me and Zach later at the end of this presentation, and I'll tell you how things turned out. And I will say before, though I won't give everything away, that we just didn't engage in chit-chat. The past was still very much on both of our minds, and the way in which we handled that was something that taught me a great deal about mercy and forms the foundation, really, of the book that I wrote about it. So the meeting with me and Zach, you know, raises the issue of mercy and justice, particularly, in a visceral and concrete way. And so in moving to discuss in greater detail what Pope Francis has said about mercy, I'd first like to return and focus a little more deeply on his Bull of Indiction, Misericordiae Vultus, that frames and introduces the Holy Year of Mercy. And most fundamentally, Pope Francis wants us to know that God's mercy is expressed through Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is the embodiment, the visual and physical, tangible side of God's mercy. And so the mercy that God offers us isn't abstract but concrete. And in Pope Francis's words, it's visceral. And it's in the life of the Church that mercy finds tangible expression. So there are the sacraments. Jesus offers us forgiveness in the sacrament of reconciliation, penance, confession, a much neglected but very important sacrament. And of course, Jesus offers us his very body and blood in the Eucharist. And the Church, as I'm sure many of you know, recognizes and promotes what are called corporal or bodily, physical works of mercy, including feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, healing the sick, visiting the imprisoned, and burying the dead. And in addition to the corporal works of mercy, there are also spiritual works of mercy, counseling the doubtful, instructing the ignorant, admonishing sinners, comforting the afflicted, forgiving offenses, bearing patiently those who do us ill, something that's particularly difficult for me, and praying for the living and the dead. And beyond such formalized expressions, Pope Francis wants the Church to become what he describes as a quote-unquote oasis of mercy for all. And the way in which Pope Francis envisions the Church becoming this oasis is by eschewing what he would characterize as the legalism that can so often characterize our discussions of the relationship between mercy and other values, particularly justice. So in Scripture, in the Gospels in particular, Pope Francis reminds us that justice is primarily conceived as what he would call or describes as the faithful abandonment of oneself to God's will. And so Jesus obviously abandoned himself to the will of God, his Father. And it was Jesus who reminded us, in the words of Scripture, quote, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." So all of us then are called to be instruments of mercy, to be bearers of mercy, because we, each and every one of us, has been shown mercy by God. And in making this point that God shows all of us mercy, Pope Francis is echoing the call of his predecessors, St. John the 23rd, St. John Paul II, and Benedict the 16th. And looking at the roster for today's presentation, a lot of you I know are recent graduates of Holy Cross, and so you don't remember the Second Vatican Council, obviously, but I do know that there are some of you in the audience who certainly remember those days. I was 1 year old when the Second Vatican II opened, and I actually was in Rome. My parents brought me there. And so those of you who are older, part of my generation or a little before, will certainly remember the seismic changes that Vatican II brought into Catholic culture and religious practice. And when St. John the 23rd opened the council, he explicitly made reference to what he described as the medicine of mercy. And from his inaugural address to the council, I'd like to offer this quotation for us to reflect upon. Quote, "At the outset of the Second Vatican Council, it is evident, as always, that the truth of the Lord will remain forever. We see, in fact, as one age succeeds another, that the opinions of men follow one another and exclude each other, and often errors vanish as quickly as they arise, like fog before the sun. The Church has always opposed these errors. Frequently she has condemned them with the greatest severity. Nowadays, however, the spouse of Christ, that is the Church, prefers to make use of the medicine of mercy rather than that of severity. She considers that she meets the needs of the present day by demonstrating the validity of her teaching rather than by condemnations." And what St. John the 23rd is talking about, either fairly or unfairly, is pre-Vatican II tendency within the Church to be very quick to, shall we say, anathematize or condemn competing opinions and to looked very darkly upon changes in modern society. Whether or not it's true that the Catholic Church was always like that, or that was the dominant way of dealing with issues in the pre-Vatican II period, it's certainly the case that the Church steadfastly condemns what it understands to be error. But what St. John the 23rd was arguing was that when you confront disagreement, particularly over an issue that you find or that you believe concerns not just opinion but truth, dialogue, discourse, and demonstration of the reasoning behind your position is the way to handle things, not blanket condemnation or knee-jerk condemnation. And I think his message, Pope John the 23rd's message, resonates even more strongly today in this day and age when the internet is so ablaze with hatred. And so if you disagree with someone, show them mercy. Discuss the issue with them. You know, don't condemn, or at least don't condemn without hearing the other person out and understanding a different point of view. And it was significant, I think, and many commentators also have noticed this, that Pope Francis proclaimed the Holy Year of Mercy on the second Sunday of Easter, which I'm sure many of you are aware is a celebration of the Divine Mercy. The Divine Mercy is a devotion associated with the Polish visionary and stigmatist Faustina Kowalska, and Pope John Paul II made her the first saint of the new millennium. So she was particularly important in St. John Paul II's own religious vision and what I would call his mysticism. And so St. Faustina's meditations on the mercy of God are particularly powerful, and it was actually in writing Mercy Matters that I became more acquainted with St. Faustina, since she's considered to be a marginal figure for some people who, you know, reflects the idiosyncrasies of Catholicism rather than the mainstream. And I certainly disagree with that characterization now, but Faustina was someone new to me. And Faustina has a particularly powerful prayer associated with the Divine Mercy that reads as follows, and it's something that's impacted me quite strongly personally. Her prayer is as follows: "Help me, O Lord, that my eyes may be merciful, so that I may never suspect or judge from appearances, but look for what is beautiful in my neighbor's souls and come to their rescue." So for St. Faustina, as for St. John Paul II, being merciful means seeing our neighbor in a new way, in a way that appreciates and recognizes how the love of God shines through them. And I think that's something we might say is fairly easy to do with someone we're close to, someone who's friendly to us, someone who reaches out to us. But it's much harder to do with someone with whom we disagree, or someone whom society marginalizes. But what Faustina is saying is that we should look at each and every person that we meet as someone through whom God's mercy and God's presence shines. And Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, before he was elected to the papacy, also explicitly mentioned the Divine Mercy and associated themes in his funeral homily for John Paul II. And later, as Benedict XVI, he extended the reflections on the Divine Mercy when he made a pilgrimage to the Divine Mercy Shrine in Krakow, Poland. And there he remarked in these words, quote, "On this occasion we encounter two mysteries, the mystery of human suffering and the mystery of divine mercy. At first sight, these two mysteries seem to be opposed to one another. But when we study them more deeply in the light of faith, we find that they are placed in reciprocal harmony through the mystery of the cross of Christ. As Pope John Paul II said in this place, quote, "The cross is the most profound bowing down of the divinity towards man. The cross is like a touch of eternal love on the most painful wounds of humanity's earthly existence, close quote. And Pope Benedict continues to address the surrounding audience. Dear friends who are sick, who are marked by suffering in body or soul, you are most closely united to the cross of Christ, and at the same time, you are the most eloquent witnesses of God's mercy. Through you and through your suffering, he bows down toward humanity with love. You who say in silence, Jesus, I trust in you, teach us that there is no faith more profound, no hope more alive, no love more ardent than the faith and hope and love of a person who in the midst of suffering places himself securely in God's hands. So what this means is that for Benedict, the Christian God is a suffering God, a God who reaches out to us and joins with us in our sufferings. And this point, made so eloquently by St. Faustina and echoed by St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, is at the core of Pope Francis's call for a Jubilee Year of Mercy. So returning again to Misericordiae Vultus, we find God's mercy encapsulated or reflected and emphasized in a number of passages from Scripture that still can profoundly speak to us. One way the Gospels speak to us of mercy is through parables, as I'm sure all of you know. And in Misericordiae Vultus, Pope Francis refers to the story of what is called the ruthless servant in Matthew chapter 18. And so in this parable, the disciple Peter asked Jesus about how many times it is necessary to forgive. And Jesus says, I do not say 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. And then Jesus goes on to speak of a servant who, when called by his master to return a huge amount of money, begs him on his knees for mercy. And so the master cancels the servant's debt. But then this servant meets another servant, a fellow servant, who owes him only a few cents, and who also begs on his knees for mercy. But this first servant refuses his request and throws him into jail. And so when the master hears of this matter, he becomes infuriated, and summoning the first servant back to him, he says, quote, should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And so Jesus concludes the parable by reflecting, so also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. So forgiveness then is at the very heart of what it means to be merciful. And in addition to parables, Pope Francis draws our attention to Jesus' healing ministry, in which Jesus literally reaches out and touches those who come to see him. And so the mercy that God shows us is something that's intimate. God not only touches us in our distress, but he shares in our sufferings, as obviously Jesus did. And so in Misericordiae Vultus, Pope Francis also speaks about how Jesus himself called upon God's mercy. So on the Mount of Olives, Jesus prayed Psalm 136, what's called the Great Hallel, which speaks of God's mercy enduring forever. And in the synagogue, Jesus read and commented upon passage from the book of Isaiah, quote, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to those in captivity, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so Pope Francis himself comments on this and says, a year of the Lord's favor or mercy, this is what the Lord proclaimed, and this is what we wish to live now. Pope Francis continues by saying, this holy year will bring to the fore the richness of Jesus' mission, echoed in the words of the prophet, to bring a word and gesture of consolation to the poor, to proclaim liberty to those bound by new forms of slavery in modern society, to restore sight to those who can see no more because they are caught up in themselves, to restore dignity to all those from whom it has been robbed. The preaching of Jesus is made visible once more in the response of faith, which Christians are called to offer by their witness. So this obviously raises the question, how do we give witness to mercy? This is all fine to say in abstract. It's all fine to mention this as a disposition that we should all have when dealing with one another. But how concretely do we show mercy? Give witness to mercy, as Pope Francis is calling us to do, especially during this extraordinary Jubilee year. Well, first, I think what Pope Francis is saying is that we give witness to mercy by privileging forgiveness over judgment. And Pope Francis argues that mercy and justice actually aren't opposed. As I mentioned before, Pope Francis understands justice as primarily giving oneself over to the will of God. So it's an act of faith. Justice then is not legalism or rigid conformity to law or legal prescripts. Instead, it is a conscious act to join ourselves with the will of God so that all might have the opportunity for reconciliation and salvation. The second way we give witness to mercy is by giving of ourselves. And there's an unmistakable Eucharistic imagery to the way in which Pope Francis speaks of God's merciful presence in our lives. Mercy is God's self-offering to us, a self-offering made manifest at every Mass when Jesus makes his very body and blood available to us in communion. And so in a similar way, or in a way that echoes this, we are called to share, to give ourselves to others, so that we might be, in Pope Francis's words, merciful as the Father is merciful. And the third way we give witness to mercy is by recognizing our own need for mercy. In this slide, I have a picture of the confessional, which evokes for me a lot of the pictures that I saw when I was in CCD as a young boy. And, you know, it might seem kind of hokey in some ways and recall a kind of superficial Catholic upbringing. But reconciliation, penance, going to the confessional is really not only where we admit our need for mercy, but where we can feel in a very tangible and transformative way God's merciful touch. And so in Misericordiae Vultus, Pope Francis emphasizes the sacrament of reconciliation as the fundamental part of the mercy which God and the Church makes available. And I actually talk about an experience I have, or I had in the confessional in my book Mercy Matters. I don't obviously give all the details, but it really was transformative. It wasn't scary. And what Pope Francis obviously wants us to do is to avail ourselves of this wonderful opportunity and to realize that mercy is always available to us and that we should never be afraid of recognizing our own need for mercy within the concrete context of our own lives. And so with that, I'd like to return to my meeting with Zach that I describe in the second chapter of the book and with which I introduced this webinar this afternoon. And what was crucial for me in meeting Zach and walking over to him is that I felt vulnerable and I felt very much in need of mercy. And so there Zach was, he was calling out to me, and all these memories of me bullying him back in my childhood came flooding back to me in a moment. And this just intensified my feeling of shame and my feeling of vulnerability. So I walked over to Zach because there really wasn't any other choice that I had. And I remember this, that there was this kind of heavy weight to my steps. I felt as though my shoulders were kind of slouched and so forth. And here it was, I thought, here's my comeuppance as a bully. And, I guess by that point I really didn't think that Zach was going to punch my face in, but I did think he was going to say some choice words to me. And after all, he certainly had the right to. Even though many years had passed, I had bullied him and I made his life painful and uncomfortable. So as I approached Zach, he reached out to me, and I thought he was going to grab actually the nape of my neck, and maybe actually was going to slug me. But instead, he gently grabbed my shoulder and he pulled me close to him. And then he said to me, looking me in the eye with his arm around me, "Matt, I'm so sorry I hit you back in 4th grade. I've been waiting 30 years to tell you that." And I was dumbfounded. I was expecting that he would confront me for being a bully. And there he was asking forgiveness from me for a time when we got into a fight. But it was doubtless a fight that I had instigated. And so in that moment, in those few seconds, Zach showed me mercy, transformative, sincere, deeply Christian way. And my encounter with Zach didn't end there. Instead, it was an opening for me to finally apologize and for Zach and me to reconcile. And I talk about this in the book. And so what I want to emphasize here is how transformative mercy can be. Mercy is something real and something that can change our lives if we're open to it. And certainly mercy is a fundamental Christian theme. Even if you go back, obviously, to the pre-Vatican II Catholic Church, there's all this emphasis on mercy, on forgiveness. So in calling for an extraordinary Holy Year of Mercy, a Jubilee of Mercy, in one sense, Pope Francis is merely re-emphasizing what is something that's fundamental to the Christian life. But in some ways, I think what Pope Francis is doing is calling us to be more mindful, more present to the opportunities to receive mercy and to show mercy in our own personal lives, very much in the way in which Zach showed me mercy. And we should never underestimate then, Pope Francis is saying, the power of mercy. Many years might pass, but mercy can still have a transformative and powerful impact. And what Pope Francis is asking us to do is to show mercy, to be open to mercy, and to make the church a merciful presence, just as God and Jesus are merciful presence in our own lives. And so with that, I will end the formal part of my remarks, and I'm open to any questions that you might ask. Thanks so much for listening. I really am grateful for this opportunity to share this time with you, albeit only virtually via the computer, but it's been very meaningful to me, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, as we allow Professor Schmalz to catch his breath, I want to thank him for sharing his time and his knowledge with us today. And I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. We have a number of questions that have been submitted throughout the formal part of the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them or all of them as possible. And I encourage you, if there's a particular question on your mind or if there's a particular topic that you would like Professor Schmalz to address, by all means, please submit a question at any time during the remaining 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so that we have available. So one question, Matt, that seems to be on people's minds, and I've seen a few of these show up on the question board, is the timing of the Year of Mercy. From your research, from your opinion, is there a particular reason? Is there a particular world event or a series of events that may have prompted Pope Francis to call for this particular Holy Year now? That seems to be on folks' minds.
Well, I can't identify a single event that either persuaded or pushed Pope Francis to proclaim this an extraordinary holy year. Instead, what I would say is that, at least in my view, there are a constellation of influences that persuaded him that calling for a Jubilee Year of Mercy was something appropriate for this day and age. Number one, Pope Francis, as George Bergoglio, as a Jesuit, always was particularly concerned with mercy and forgiveness in terms of his own pastoral work, in terms of his own ministry. And there are a variety of stories, not all of which are confirmed, about his own personal transformation, being shown mercy by fellow Jesuits who felt as though they didn't support him or they didn't receive enough support from him during their persecution by the government. So mercy has always been a concern of Pope Francis, even before he was elected to the papacy. Number two, clearly in the United States, in Latin America, and in Western Europe, there is an issue with many Catholics falling away from the Church. While in the United States, numbers have remained fairly steady because of immigration, there are a large number of disaffected Catholics who have fallen away from the Church. And I think what Pope Francis is doing is, through this Year of Mercy, trying to call Catholics back to the Church, those who might feel alienated because they feel excluded, and emphasize how the Church is a community of love, a community of mercy. Thirdly, I think it's clear to everyone when you look at the scope of world affairs or just our own interpersonal relationships, how much mercy is important. We live in a violent world. We live in a world also of social media in which the discourse is increasingly mean-spirited and vituperative. So this is a very good time, I think, in Pope Francis's view, to be reminded of the importance of mercy, especially when the pace of life seems so merciless. And finally, he wants us to remember those who are shut out, those who are excluded, and not just disaffected Catholics, but particularly the poor, those who we can quite easily overlook. And the point is not only to show the marginalized mercy, but to receive mercy from them and receive forgiveness from them because we have been complicit in their exclusion.
Matt, in your research, how has the Church responded to this Year of Mercy? And there's some questions in particular about the American Church's response. Is this resonating with American Catholics? Is this having an impact, say, on the global Church, but there's interest particularly on the American Church?
Well, before I talk about the American Church, I'll just say that I was in India a couple of weeks ago, and I was in the city of Bangalore, which is in South India. It's a tech hub, and we've begun a program for Holy Cross students in Bangalore. And I went by the cathedral, and there was a big poster proclaiming the Holy Year of Mercy. So on one level, certainly it's something that's been publicized, and that it's something that is a worldwide phenomenon. However, within the American Catholic Church, at least from my perspective, it seems as though the response has been varied. That is, I'm sure many of you in your parishes have had special prayer services relating to mercy. You might have had study groups reading books or particularly studying the Gospels in relation to the theme of mercy. But I think that's sort of variable on a local level. I think within the Church as a whole in the United States, there certainly has been thematic emphasis on mercy, particularly in connection to issues surrounding immigration and the hateful tone of the presidential campaign. But I have yet to see a kind of consistent approach to the Year of Mercy that embraces the entirety of American Catholics or American Catholicism. But clearly it is resonating with a good number of people on the parish level, and Pope Francis, in his own personal witness, has shown us how important mercy is. And so I think the importance and impact of this year will extend beyond November 20th, which is when the Jubilee Year of Mercy officially ends or closes.
Matt, there's been a few comments or questions about the relationship between the Year of Mercy and one of Pope Francis's recent encyclicals, Laudato Si, on the environment. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between this holy year and the Pope's views on the environment?
That's a great question. And I'd just like to mention that here at Holy Cross, we've had a continuing discussion about Laudato Si, sponsored by the Father Burroughs and the Office of the President, so that we can, as members of the Holy Cross community, think much more deeply and much more intentionally about care for the environment and about the environmental impact of what we do. I think certainly, or at least conventionally, many of us might think of mercy in terms of forgiveness. Forgiveness of someone who's done us wrong, or receiving forgiveness for sins that we've committed. But what Pope Francis is saying and emphasizing to us is that human beings do not stand alone. We are interconnected with our own physical surroundings, our own environment. And that the environment itself is in need of mercy, given the way it's been treated by us, human beings, who have oftentimes seen the environment and our physical surrounding, plants and animals, as only having an instrumental significance for our benefit. And so there is a direct tie-in between this Jubilee Year of Mercy and Laudato Si, because by showing mercy not only to each other as human beings but to the environment, we recognize the interconnectedness of the entirety of God's creation.
Several folks who participated in this webinar seem very touched by your personal story with your classmate Zach, and that example of personal mercy. But we do have several questions about kind of taking the framework of this year, taking some of the themes of this year and applying it to issues such as terrorism or random acts of violence, and how does mercy and forgiveness and some of those global issues intersect, and where can Catholics find mercy and forgiveness in some of those larger issues that affect millions?
That's a great question, and obviously that's really putting the issue of mercy to the test. In the book, Mercy Matters, I actually devote an entire chapter to a class that I taught here at Holy Cross called Religion and Violence. And the focus of the chapter is not upon me as a teacher, but it's on students and how they worked through the aftermath of the Boston bombing, which happened while the class was going on. And everyone emphasized the need for forgiveness, because what happens oftentimes if you don't forgive is that the cycle of violence continues, that there is a kind of reciprocal effect. When someone commits an act of violence, then you respond with an act of violence and so forth. But all students in this class were also very, very much aware that it's one thing to say that in theory, that we have to forgive, even when it comes to random acts of violence. It's a much different thing to do it in practice, and what was particularly touching and moving about this class is that many students had friends who were in the Boston Marathon, had parents who were in the Boston Marathon, so the bombing affected them. And in trying to work through those issues, the students were quite sensitive to the fact that it was difficult to forgive. And so I don't want to kind of respond to a question like that in an easy, superficial way. Jesus says we should forgive our enemies, and that's that, so you should forgive. I think we have to recognize that the process of forgiveness takes a great deal of time, and also forgiveness does not necessarily mean leaving oneself open to further violence, that defense and defensive postures, whether it's emotionally or physically, whether it's concerning abuse, emotional abuse by a family member or random acts of violence, those kind of defensive measures are entirely appropriate. But we do have to realize, I think, and this is what Pope Francis is arguing, that there has to be an end to hatred and violence. And someone has to decide to forgive. And unless someone decides to forgive, the cycle of violence will continue. But in saying that, we should not underestimate the difficulty that forgiveness presents us. I mean, it's the most difficult thing we as human beings can do, to forgive someone who has wronged us. And in my own personal view, and I think the Pope would agree with me, we need some supernatural help. We need some divine help in order to reach that position when we can actually forgive someone who either commits a random act of violence or who harms us individually as a person.
And as we near the end of our time together, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question. There's several people who participated today, Matt, who were interested in what inspired you to write the book or to research mercy. And would you be open to sharing some of those personal comments? What inspired you to devote this time researching and writing about mercy?
Well, I've been very grateful for the opportunity to write for the media. And so I wrote for the Washington Post, and then I wrote for Crux, a Catholic website that was associated with the Boston Globe. And so there were two pieces of writing that drew the attention of our Sunday Visitor, Catholic Press, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and they asked me to write about mercy. But to be honest, it was my experience with Zach that really got me thinking about mercy, because it really was a transformative moment for me. And then a couple years passed, and I wrote about the question of mercy more broadly on the basis of 4 months I spent in Sri Lanka managing or running a study abroad program. And Sri Lanka was just recovering from civil war. And I remember going to this war-torn village and seeing an image of the Divine Mercy, St. Faustina's image of the Divine Mercy. And I reflected upon that in a writing for Crux. And when the Holy Year of Mercy came around, our Sunday Visitor asked me to write the book. But I did use the book as an opportunity for me to focus on mercy much more intentionally in my own personal life. And so there are two things that I did in writing the book. The first thing I did was reach out to people in my past, some of whom I hadn't talked to for 10 or 20 years, and acknowledge them as people who had shown me mercy, who had had a transformative impact on me. The second thing that I did is that I went on a search for my birth mother. I'm an adopted child, and the last chapter of the book details my search for my birth mother and working through those kinds of feelings surrounding mercy relating to my adoption. And so in some ways, what happened was I was writing about mercy in terms of my own personal experiences and then a little more academically. And then when I had the opportunity to actually put it all together in a book, I used it as the impetus for me to not only talk the talk, but kind of walk the walk and tie up some loose ends in my own personal life by recognizing those people who had shown me love and mercy in ways that I had never acknowledged.
Few people have asked, is the book available in the Holy Cross bookstore if they're going to be visiting campus? Well, I know that we're at our time right now, so many thanks to Professor Schmalz for sharing his time and knowledge with us today. And we hope to continue offering these lunchtime learning webinars in the future. Stay tuned for upcoming notices about future dates. They'll be coming. And in the meantime, have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.